How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, enjoying this kind of summer. Be nice to have a bit of rain. I'm stuck in the southeast, so not
Oh,
seen rain for a while. But yeah, no, I'm good, thanks.
we got plenty of rain here. I can send you some over. we're
Yeah,
used we're
I
used
don't
to it
know
by
why
now.
they don't pump it around like they pump oil.
I know. I know
We,
that they'd probably charge for it though.
yeah,
I was funny because I was going I'd read your book years ago when it came out first, and I was looking. I said, "Oh, I'm gonna go over it again, and read some stuff." And then I realized my friend has the book, and I'm like, "Oh my god!" So, but I can remember, I can still remember a lot of the stuff from the book. But I love that book. It was such a great book.
thank you.
Man, you lived an amazing life. I was surprised by the '70s stuff. I was like, "Wow, that was crazy, man."
No, it was. I mean, the '70s, I think, was a brilliant decade for me. But also, I think generally in the country, it was kind of that whole late '60s thing, the whole kind
Yeah,
of flamboyant, and that was just kind of London and the kind of cool people, you know. But the '70s, everybody dressed flamboyantly, and it was just like it was a mad decade.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, no, it feels like somebody else's life sometimes because,
really,
well, yeah, because even I look at all the people I work with, and I can't believe it either. You know what I mean? It was like a lot of luck, huge amount of hard work. I mean, we work 60, 80, 100-hour weeks, but
wow,
I do believe that luck played a big part in what happened to me because I just bump into people and end up, you know, like with Robert Palmer, I kind of met him by chance and then ended up doing 4 albums with him, you know. There were various people like that through my career where I just kind of met somebody in unusual circumstances or even on the street, and then it's led to, you know, a
yeah.
career.
I remember you saying that when you met Tim and you were just on when you about talking about the color of spring, and then you get working with Talk Talk. It's crazy how
Yeah,
life is like that.
that was a really interesting time for me because it was kind of '86. I had a difficult time in the '80s. Really, it took me a long time to adjust to the new technology. I didn't really like it, and also I didn't like a lot of the sounds of the '80s. You know, that massive drum sound and
Yeah,
everything overproduced. You know, so it wasn't really my thing. So the '80s was kind of weird, and I did have some success with like King and China Crisis and various things, but '86, I was about to kind of leave the business. You know, I'd had 20 years, had a great time, but I wasn't working. I didn't work for 6 months, and
wow.
I bumped into Tim by chance. You know, again one of those kind of situations. I went to collect a tape. He was there, set up for a session. We got talking because I knew him from the past. I thought Color of Spring was just a phenomenal record. I still do,
Yeah,
and I just kind of was, yeah, I was kind of almost speaking out aloud, you know. I noticed, like, I'd love to work with a band like that. And then, you know, 3 months later, I get the phone call saying, you know, were you serious? Come and meet Mark. And it led to me staying in the business, but also 13 years of working with Mark.
incredible. Incredible. It's
Yeah.
amazing, like the amount of like because I knew you. I'm not sure there's a is that a point of entry for most people with you is a Talk Talk, but I knew you from Talk Talk. So when I read the book, I was like, oh my god, like it was crazy the amount of people you work with. I like, did you work with Duke Ellington?
Yeah.
Ah, man, that must have been insane.
It was a sad. See, my brother Terry Brown, who does Rush or did Rush,
Yes, 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 crazy.
he's older than me and he was in the business before me. So that's how I found out that this job existed, you know. And I used to go and hang out when I was like 13, 14 years old. He was only like 17, 18 years old. And so I watched, you know, the Yardbirds and PJ Proby and some of these kind of 65, 64. And then I got a job at Olympic. He built Morgan Studios in London, and then met a Canadian couple who basically said, "Come to Canada and build, you know, the first 16-track studio in Canada." And he asked me if I wanted to do it, so we both went out in '69 and built this. Well, the first 16-track studio, you know, that was in Canada. Um, I came back after about a year to visit my parents and got offered this job at Ireland. So I stayed. But no, we had the studio up and running. It was fairly early on. Duke Ellington was playing Toronto as a gig, and phoned up. It was all very last minute that he wanted to come down and do some recording in the studio. So he came down with the full band. I mean, that's what I remember. I remember no screens. The room was quite dead, but the drummer's in the corner. There's a brass section in front of the window, and a huge brass section. The piano, there was like everyone's just sat up in the room, about
cool.
20 people, and it was just remarkable. We did definitely did 2 tracks, if not 3, but it was just that. It was like, okay. I mean, I've got an outtake somewhere, and you just hear him counting in, and you just go, okay, all right. Just it's kind of counting, and they're off, and it's just like, wow, the brass.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. And what I remember is that because it was, I say, it was really like, we heard about it in the afternoon. We sat up for 7, 3 or 4 hours. Bang, it's done. And when I was clearing up, I just remember where all the brass guys were sitting. There was just hundreds of reeds. They were just like they'd play 2 takes, then change the reed, and it was just all this kind of carnage, if you like. But I got to work with him.
It's incredible. Like, I love the way records were made back then. That's what I hate about my kind of generation of making music. It's so kind of like I love that idea of people in the room. Like when you watch not watch, but hear about old sessions with Pet Sounds and the Wrecking Crew and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a magic that you can't.
It really is, though. I mean, there really is, because that's why I've kind of drifted from not really working too much. I love having 5 musicians in a room. It is just the best. It really is, and you can fake it. You can do all kinds of other things, but you cannot beat that. I mean, my experience of having people like Little Feat or the Meters, or these mad bands with Carol Kay and James Jameson that we put together in LA, but having 5, 6 people in a room just playing it up, it's just like, and it makes it's actually quite an easy way to work. That's the other thing. I know there's a lot of stress in setting it all up, and you've got to be on the case, but if you've got really good players, they know how to get sounds, they deliver you 80% of it. So your job as an engineer, especially for me then, was like not to mess it up. You know what I mean? Just capture what's happening, little tweaks, but you were just capturing things, and it was just exciting.
Yeah, they kind of mix themselves, don't they? Really, in a lot of ways.
Because you are, that's the thing with that lack of technology back then. I mean, I learned when I joined in '67 at Olympic, it was 4-track. And I did an interview the other day. They're doing a documentary on Arthur Brown, and his Fire record, the LP was Crazy World of Arthur Brown, was 4-track, and there were some remarkable records made on 4-track. Those guys, Keith Grant, he'd have like a 50-piece orchestra mixing it to stereo. Wow. So he's recording and mixing it. And then it would go on to 2 tracks. You got 2 tracks, and we did Dusty Springfield and Leonard Cohen, all these people like that. So I got in at the end of the 4-track and just watched these guys on another planet. I mean, really, it was an art. And then 8-track came in, which made things slightly easier, certainly get a better stereo. Once it went 16, 20, you know what I mean? Once you had 46-track in the 80s, and we talk, we had 100-odd tracks of analog. Once you get into that world, anything's obviously possible, but it does make you work differently.
Yeah.
There's something about having 16 tracks, 24 tracks, a band, and having to make it kind of work in that environment. It's very exciting. And when you pull it off, like you say, things like, the Beach Boys, what remarkable kind of record. But, even if you go back 10 years to Phil Spector with his mono recordings, they were, I still play them and just get blown away by this mono, but this overall size and sound that the guy got. And I always loved tape because you got this depth and you could play around with levels, and over compress it, and that analog format for me in the 70s, you see, was absolutely brilliant. I mean, I just adored it. And the 80s, it just became, there's a lot more technology, all that early digital that came in.
Yeah.
The SSL, you were kind of all through the 70s, it was manual mixing, it was getting sounds at source. There was this kind of constant on the edge vibe about it. And then it all started to get very controlled from like late 70s into the 80s.
Yeah.
And I sometimes, I'm slow to adapt sometimes, but also if I think I believe in something that is just so good and just gets such great results, I'm reluctant to go in this other thing. So the 80s was tough. And now, I was talking to somebody yesterday and he was just saying, man, I've got, 120 tracks or unlimited tracks on my computer, but I just cannot capture, that sound, what those guys were doing. And it is leakage. It's not hi-fi. It was a different mentality, I think, of making records. It's become a real industry now, hasn't it? There's a formula.
Yeah.
Everyone's at home with their laptop, making records. Some of them are brilliant. I mean, I'm impressed by a lot of stuff I hear, but it's a different world.
Yeah, and a lot of like what I hate about modern music a lot is just there's no ambition in the chords to use. It's the same derivative chords. Like you could take a song from 5 years ago, production wise, and now, and it's not really that much of a difference.
Yeah.
They're doing the same shit, like, and it's just all the snare sounds the same, the kick sounds the same, the vocal sounds the same.
You've got to remember that when everyone's in similar format like Pro Tools or Logic, with all the plugins and all the samples, everyone's in a way dealing with the same sounds or the same stuff. There's the same compressors, certain compressors that, there's about 5 that people tend to use. So everything's plug-in, everyone's using similar stuff. And as soon as you pass something out of the computer into an old bit of analog gear or something that's actually real, it's amazing what it can do to the track, So, we've been fed, like many things, this thing that digital's great and this whole format is just like amazing. But it is, as a tool, I mean, you can do stuff that is unheard of, but as a sound, I'm not sure that records, even for the last 20 years, really, whether they actually, occasionally something comes along, but do they sound as good as this 40, 50 years before, this amazing wealth of 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s recordings? I'm not sure putting everything in the box, treating everything, whether it's the right approach, I mean, it isn't for me. I like reality. I like things to be raw. My thing was always just trying to capture organically the reality of where you were. So whether it's John Martin and that whole, pumping music across a lake, or being in a sleazy New Orleans place with the meters, you make the most out of the environment you're in, but you're basically for me, was just trying to capture that moment,
I think we kind of, it's like if you go, I've said this before to a few people, like on Netflix, I go on Netflix, I put something on and I end watch nothing because I have too many choices. And I think human brains, we're not meant to deal with too many choices because then we kind of can't make a choice. We're kind of, if you have 4 choices, you have to make one. If you have 100 choices.
And we have now, especially in the recording side, and I think it's the same in the kind of whole visual video thing, but I mean, we have unlimited choices. That's the problem. And I guess because of 4-track, 8-track technology that I grew up on, you had to get the sound at source. You got the sound that you wanted, and then during the process of copying and bouncing and whatever, you tried not to lose that sound. Now from my experience, people are very reluctant to make a decision on a sound and go, "That's fucking brilliant," let's keep that.
Yeah.
And it printed like that. There's always, people always want options, it seems,
Yeah.
and control. So that thing of like, well, yeah, but in the mix, I might want to bring this up 1 dB. And in a way, they're more completely lost in the kind of whole process of making a record rather than, fuck, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? If the bass drum should have been 1 dB louder, yeah, wouldn't it have been lovely? But it's fine. You know what I mean? I think we're just, our focus is in a different area to what definitely my focus was for the first 30 odd years. I mean, Talk had a strange effect on probably all of us that worked on it. I was never really, I couldn't approach music the same after those records.
Yeah.
So that 20 odd years of, doing bands or having an approach to it all, after spending, Laugh at Spirit Heat and Laugh at Stock, 4 or 5 years with Mark and that setup, I couldn't, I couldn't see the point of so many things. It all seemed like, well, yeah, but that's all been done, and I do this. You know what I mean? I was completely taken over by this whole Mark Hollis approach to music. It was so strong, and we spent so long in a studio making those records that it definitely had an effect. So then I had a whole different, slightly more open, looser approach from the early 90s onwards.
Yeah.
And I did get rid of a lot of the old stuff that I used to do. It's like, yeah, well, I won't do that anymore. I'll have a whole different drum setup, or I'll have, So I wasn't so much. It's hard to explain, but when I spent 6 years as a house engineer. When you were working in that environment, you had to kind of deliver goods pretty quickly. So you had a setup that you would use for drums, especially mics that you pretty much nearly always used. A position, there were things that you knew that in that position, in that room, you'd get a pretty good sound. And if we did this, so there was a certain amount of because of the speed we worked, of a process, if you like, not really a factory, because Ireland was never really like that, but you have a routine or a thing that works, and unless somebody gives you the time or the freedom to push those boundaries, you tend not to do it too much if you're like just a jobbing engineer, And Mark, that whole Talk thing was just suddenly somebody kind of going, you have unlimited time, you have unlimited mic, have got unlimited analog tracks in a way.
Yeah.
Just, do whatever you fancy doing. So it was remarkable.
Yeah.
And it also had a huge effect that you couldn't, when you finished it, you didn't just going to go, oh, yeah, fine, put that away and move on. It was like always with you.
Wow. It's kind of like having a kind of come down, isn't it? I can imagine. You're just like you're high almost on it.
There was a huge kind of, it took, you think you're in the studio for a year making a record anyway, in fairly kind of absurd environment. And then you finish, and there's a huge wave of not so much depression, but a void, because every day you've gone in at 11 in the morning, till 11 at night for 5 days a week for nearly a year. When that suddenly stops, it's like life support system, it was just like, Jesus. So it took about 3 months, probably after Spirit of Eden, to just settle and get back into actually work. Because that was the other thing. It was very hard to approach certain projects or things that I was offered that I just kind of thought, because it wasn't I wanted everything to be like Talk, but having gone through that experience, so many things seemed a bit kind of mundane or okay, so it took me a while to get back. And then after Laughing Stock, which was a really tough kind of record to do, it probably took me 6 months or something.
Wow.
Back into the world.
I remember in the book you were saying your wife was in after Spirit of Eden. If you ever work with them again, you have to leave the house. So you did when you did laugh. It's like, I thought that was
I
good,
did
man.
move out, yeah. I mean, when you look back on some of this stuff, it's like 30 years ago now, but see, I've always been very selfish. I've always, in a way, put work or being in the studio or whatever as priority for me.
Yeah.
It's always come as the number one thing. So my family has had to kind of deal with that. But yeah, no, and my wife, you know, she used to work in Ireland. That's how I met her. But she never said anything, you see, for 20 odd years about any band. And she was around for pretty crazy situations. And it was just this one, you know, sort of Spirit of Eden. I remember coming back after it and kind of turning the lights out, obviously, and putting it on to play with my Revox reel to reel.
Yeah.
Played it to my Sally and to my kids. So, right, this is what I've been doing for the last year, you know. And they were kind of, I know, 11, 13 or something. And, you know, at the end of the 43 minutes of hearing something that's pretty unusual in the best of sense. And they kind of went, oh, okay. You know, they went off and did their homework. And Sally said, if you ever work with them again. And it was, I think we were probably much more difficult to be with than we realised, if you know what I mean. It was like Tim, Mark and I pretty much, and Sean, the assistant, you know, 12 hours a day just locked into this. And even when you had days off, you didn't suddenly kind of switch off. And you know, I used to come back home because I lived in London, came back at the weekends or the days off. And you couldn't really get into much, you know. I mean, your head was still somewhere else,
Yeah.
in the dark, with an oil projector.
That must have been crazy, man.
You probably came back to the real world. It's like,
Yeah. I read Ben Wardell, I think I said his name wrong, his book recently, and it's a really interesting book, but it was crazy. I shouldn't use the word asshole, but Mark sounded like he could be an asshole sometimes, like pretty hard on the other guys in the band. I was kind of like, whoa, man.
I mean, the one thing that I thought when I read the book was how honest it rang true.
Yeah, I was surprised by that.
Because the thing is, Mark had this really, you know, he was very funny, had a real humour, but the humour in a way could be quite dark.
Mm.
And when I first started working with him on Spirit of Eden, he would say to people in the room, or if somebody fucked up, or a musician goes, "Oh, you really are." And the thing is, I didn't know until later this was just an extension of the years when they were on the road, where they called everyone cunt.
Yeah.
So this was a way of saying, you know, you're a cunt, but just going on, you really are. And it was a running joke, you know. Many times a day, you'd hear Mark in the background just going, "Oh, you really are."
Wow.
But it turned over the period of a year, and definitely with the way they treated Paul and Lee when he did Laughing Stock, it turned into a really dark, vicious kind of thing. So that kind of what turned out to be kind of, "Oh, you really are," which was kind of turned out to be quite dark. And they had a hard time. I mean, Mark, I was amazed with the book because I went through various things with Mark, obviously, during that period. And it was very interesting hearing these other input of people that had been really close to him. You know, the guy, the original co-writer.
Simon Brenner, is it?
Simon
Brenner. Yeah.
And the fact that he never really got like well looked after, he didn't really get the credits or the, you know, and I mean that just rings so true for me, you know. It's like, oh, shit, right? So another one, and then you go through the book. There's quite a few, and even people like what's his name, Londres Pendleton or something, the guy, the keyboard player who played on Pendros, he played on Mark's solo album.
The teacher, the guy who was the teacher.
Yeah. And I saw him recently, but he, again, when you read the book, Mark had a really, because I met at the time with Mark, so this is kind of mid 90s, I guess, or late 90s, before we did the solo album.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, he's a really quiet, you know, you know, perfectly like gentle character.
Mm-hmm.
Mark and him had a really close relationship. They went playing golf together.
Mark Hollis playing golf.
Yeah, I know. But they're really close. And then one day, you know, they left after a particular meeting, and Lawrence is there saying, you know, so he headed off, and I never saw him again.
Yeah, there was a lot of that in the book. It was like, and I never saw him again. I was like, whoa, that was weird.
I think Mark, I mean, he definitely suffered from, he was definitely on, you know, on the scale. Exactly kind of what he had is hard to know, but he definitely had something going on that he could get so close to people, would always be just like pushing people away, or walking away. You know, I mean, he was always just like heading off somewhere, which eventually became like a permanent thing.
Yeah.
But apart from like his wife and his kids, everyone else seemed to be disposable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I got from the book. I was like, he'd be friends with people and then never hear from them again. I know there's sometimes when you work on things and, you know, you always go, oh, we'll be friends and we'll stay in touch. And like half the people you kind of don't. But when you do stay in touch with people a long time and then they kind of shut you out, there's a certain, you know, you're
it's an odd one though, you know, the whole music thing when you're making an album, because you get so close to these people. I mean, you're seeing them. I mean, look at my experience with like, you see those people more than you see your family.
Yeah, yeah.
You become this little team of people, so you are incredibly close and incredibly connected.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing finishes, and sometimes you know, you stay friends and you see those people, like with Robert Palmer, where, you know, he became a good mate. We did many albums together, or John Martin. There's various people that you stayed friends with and saw.
Yeah.
And there are some projects where, you know, that intensity, and suddenly it's finished and everyone just goes home and you might never see them again. And that's something that I've always got used to, even before the Talk. I mean, Talk always just took everything, I guess, to an extreme, because you'd finish a record. So instead of that, you know, the final mix after all that amount of time and energy and work, but there'd be no kind of pint of Guinness down the pub, or a celebration of like, hey, we finished the album. They were one of the lowest key as far when the album was finished. It was just like the end of another day. Yeah. And I remember when we finished, well, both albums really, but Laughing Stock, you know, just Tim and Mark loading up their vehicles with harmoniums and all the gear that they hadn't yet taken back. And it was like, okay, see you then, night, you know, and everyone just drove off to different parts of the country. And it was kind of odd. And I mean, Tim and I met up after that to master the album. I didn't see Mark for about at least 2 years after Spirit of Eden, about 4 years after Laughing Stock.
Wow. And
then he just suddenly would pop up. You know, when we did his solo thing, he said, I'll come out to the house, and it was when he was up in Suffolk still. You know, I played, you know, these new tracks, and he'd got the whole of his album he recorded on Logic with samples, but he'd written it all, and it was all there as an album.
Wow.
And, you know, very different to the previous two that I'd worked with him on, which seemed very experimental, or just like making it up and just capturing bits and moving it and sticking it where he wanted it. This was all there, scored out. And, you know, we went on to do that and a few other bits after that. But no, he made a record almost like it wasn't really every 7 years, but it felt like that kind of every 5 years he made a record and would just be doing something else in between. He'd just disappear. You know?
It's such a shame for someone that like had such an amount of talent to just kind of, you know, give up, like, not give up, but just stop making records, you know, releasing them. Like I see someone like Paddy McAloon, who still, you know, he puts out a record the odd few times, and He did that. Did you ever hear that record, I Troll the Megahertz?
No, I mean, that
Oh
sounds familiar.
man, that is an incredible record. He had hearing problems, so he couldn't really do anything with bass. So he made this kind of neo-classical record. It's like just all strings. Like it's all like classical. It's almost like how would you say, like minimalistic classical music. But it's an amazing record. 'Cause like he comes from Prefab Sprout, and then he does this like amazing record. And I always kind of saw him and Mark in that kind of same vein of like kind of not odd guys, but like they go off on their own and then they pop
Yeah.
up and
No, I mean, I never, I mean, even because I mean, Mark and I were in touch from kind of 2000, I guess, when we, when it all stopped, up until just a few months before he died. I mean, I didn't know him. Yeah, no, I was in touch with him in the November of 18 when he died in the February, but I had no idea he was ill. That was the other thing. He never told anyone. So apart from his close family and I guess his manager, no one knew.
wow.
So when Paul, when Paul Lee and I all found out, it was all just that shock of like, God, and no one knew. Paul was saying, God, I mean, I didn't know. We were just, but I kept in touch with him because a lot of people would track me down, not so much to get to Mark, but to offer him stuff. He got offered some amazing opportunities through the last 20 years. He was given the Olympia in Paris. He could do a gig that, he could do anything he wanted to do. He could stand up there, recite poetry. He could whatever he wanted to do. And he got offered some amazing things. So, and that would come through, and I would feel obligated to pass this on,
Mm-hmm.
But he'd nearly always come back and just, he did get involved in a couple of trying to do some film music, which made sense, although not a lot of it ever got used. I still think he was at home with his piano and his beautiful guitars and things, still doing stuff. I can't believe that when he kind of decided to pull away from all the business, which I totally understand him doing, I can't believe he just stopped. He must have been doing stuff. It just seems too bizarre. But considering he was so, in a way, removed anyway, the 13 years I spent with him, I never expected him to walk away, as you put it, and just disappear and stop doing stuff. But he always felt as if he was, 10 feet away from anything that could be, commercial or poppy. He seemed to go totally against the grain of being what he could have been, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Say you take the Colour Spring album with the kind of the hits on that, or the style of writing, that is one thing that he could have carried on. Obviously, he went this other route, but he could have still done things. Tim, I think, felt after Laughingstock, which is why he didn't get involved anymore, but he said, we've kind of gone as far as we can go, because we erased so much stuff and everything was, drums on one track and everything was so minimal that once you strip it down to the bare bones,
yeah,
it was like, where do you go from here? Which is why after, it was a good break for 5 years or more, but his solo album was something very, very different,
Yeah.
But we had nowhere to go after Laughingstock.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. We were talking about Mark's solo record, and when I listened to it the other day, and I always noticed something. I don't know, is this to do with the way you record it? But sometimes when Mark is singing, it's like his voice is like kind of moving. Did you do it with two mics? Was it two mics, or just how was that?
Yeah.
Or was it one mic? Or were my hearings fucked?
Every Spirit of Eden, we use like the Neumann head, which is a 3-dimensional head for the drums. Then the Laughingstock is one mic on the drums. When we came to do Mark's solo album, he wanted it to be like those 50s records where you had kind of one mic and people stood up for solos. So we updated it to 2 mics. So we actually had a matched pair of these M49s from the 50s.
Okay.
Sitting, in a chair in front of the studio. and these were the mics at kind of head height, and they didn't change. We never touched them for the whole 6 months that we were recording. So we used two mics. That is the stereo. So anyone that came, when anyone came into play, they obviously had to stand in the right position to be in wherever we wanted them in the stereo, because we couldn't change it. It wasn't mono stuff that we could change later. So we originally, so the room was really important to do that. So we originally went to Air and set up in Studio 2 at Air with the band, which is quite, it was like a 8-piece woodwind section, and then you've got a couple of acoustics, bass, drums, the piano, the harmonium. So we brought everyone in and put our mics up, and then positioned people in the room and did a trial day, and we decided that Air was too bright, too live. So we went to another studio, I think it was Lansdowne, that was too dead, and then we ended up at Master Rock. So what we eventually did at Master Rock was put out these mics up and get a kind of a level on, and we had an 80-channel desk, and we were just two channels.
Brilliant.
For 6 months, and then we would brought everyone in, got them to balance and play the part as a band, and then we marked kind of who it was on the floor, and then we recorded everybody individually. Because the thing about Mark, he wants spontaneity and he wants the first take, but he also wants total control. And trying to get them both is like insane, but that's what he was like. So we recorded everybody individually. So we had them in stereos on the desk with our 80 kind of channel desk, but we had multiple stereos of these mics. So we could change the balance slightly. But the reason why his vocal does it, so when we came to do the vocal, because we got these kind of two mics sitting like this, and Dominic Miller and Mark would sit, very close, 2 foot away to do their acoustic parts. When he came to sing, I said, so shall we just put up one mic? And he said, no, I think we need to keep it in the atmosphere that everything else has been done in. And he had a tendency when he was singing to kind of move his head to the left. When he was just singing, it was just a natural reaction he had. So you're the first person, because I mean you're right, it does, it moves, but you're the first person to actually say, so you kind of, why does it move? Well,
right.
But that's why. It's because we still have the two mics. He's sitting in the front of the two, but because he's doing this kind of movement with his head, it kept favouring the left mic or our right, as it were.
Oh wow. Wow, it's an incredible. I love that record too. I think that's an incredible record. Like, man, your engineering and production and everything is like, you've made like some of the best records I've ever heard. Like, I remember the first time I heard Spirit of Eden, my friend who was massively into Talk, and I really wasn't into any 80s music at that time. I would have been about 19. My opinion of 80s music was all that shit like Duran Duran and all that nonsense.
Totally, yeah.
It's just terrible. Like, it's it's more about the look than the music, and that's just.
But it was kind of all tied in with MTV and stuff. But it was all this larger than life, drum sounds that were huge and keyboard brass and these massive productions, and I hated it. I mean, you're right. I mean, Duran Duran, ABC, there were so many.
They were on TV the other day, and I just like, they were dressed like, what was the dress? I don't know what they were dressed like. What the fuck? You're like pirates or something. But anyways, my friend put on Talk to her in his car. He put on Spirit of Eden and the Rainbow, and the minute that kind of guitar and harmonica and everything came in, I was like, holy shit, man! What is that? So that's when I got into Talk.
Yeah, the harmonica is fantastic,
incredible.
It's Mark Feltner, but he's doing solos, but he's doing like 8 passes, and then we were grabbing this note and putting that one backwards, and so there was we grab the best and then construct this solo. So although it sounds I mean, that's the genius for me with Spirit of Eden, especially because I think it could have been a massive disaster because of
Right.
well, you know what I mean. You allow people to have an unlimited budget. You let them go into a studio for a year and experiment. You know, it can spell disaster. You
And
know,
it sounds like a band, but it's
it,
not a band. It sounds like
it
people playing, isn't it?
sounds like five guys in a
Yeah.
room, and that's for me is the success for me personally. Is that with all the individual notes and all the trickery that was going on, it actually sounds totally real and credible, and it sounds like five guys nodding off.
Yeah.
That's its genius for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the dynamics, the fact that something quiet is quiet, something loud, you know what I mean? It was just exciting
Yeah.
to have that kind of freedom again. Where, you know, because we had this, I mean, it came really from Mark, I suppose, but it developed into something that we used all across Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock, which was to open the mics up really loud.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they were picking up the playground, school playground, and people up in other parts of the building. So they were really wide open mics. And then to play as quiet as you can. That was very much Mark's thing. So, you know, when you listen to something and there's like one guitar that suddenly leaps out, one note, you know, just it's because, you know, everything is actually really loud, but you're playing really quiet. And then you catch this one thing and the dynamics are huge.
Yeah. The dynamics of that record are beautiful. Almost like kind of classical music.
Yeah.
Oh, you know the way it goes from like just can be something really mellow to like a fucking timpani comes in, you're like, whoa, what the hell was that? It's like that. Talk Talk has that beautiful kind of the dynamics of it is just incredible. Like I can't imagine if someone did it today, they'd probably have it'd be like a blob of like, you know what I mean? Like that's what I hate about modern production. There's no dynamics.
It would be easier to do today, you know, in theory on today's technology, because we would, you know, we were cutting and pasting and moving stuff around, but doing it all with SMPTE codes and offsets and having 5 machines that we could kind of move.
That must have been so hard.
It was a minefield. I mean, you know, the assistant on Spirit of Eden, Sean, he was probably about, you know, 25 or something. You know, he was relatively experienced. He was like my shadow, and he kept this massive recall thing, which was brilliant because if you're not using EQ or you're not using compression, you kind of think, well, there's nothing really going on here, so you don't have to recall anything. But because of the nature of working with Mark, he would, you know, record a piano where we just got one mic that's flung over some girder, so it's maybe 10 foot above the piano with the lid off. You know, that's our piano sound. And you think, well, we're not EQing it, we're not compressing it, and that's the mic, so it's easy.
Yeah.
And Mark would come back maybe 3 months later. Mark would come in and say, oh, the piano on such and such, I just want to add one note. And you'd recall because, you know, you measure the mic is measured from 3 different locations. It's the serial number of that mic. We would take the air temperature of the room, the humidity of the room, all of that. Because it made such a difference to sound. It was a nightmare. I mean, it seemed so easy because of so many things that we weren't doing, but so complicated because everything was just wide open. Yeah. So the temperature in the room made a massive difference. On Laughing Stock, because we had this drum mic that we put up that eventually ended up being like 28 feet away from the drums, we didn't think, Tim and I didn't think, we just said, sounds great here, mic'd it up with this 47. That's our drum sound. And then it dawned on us that when Lee's out there playing, the delay of like 28 milliseconds or whatever, and it would change if the room was warm and hot and warm, you know, sticky. It would be 30 milliseconds. If it was really cold, because we had the air conditioning on, and you come in the next day and it's cold and dry, it would be like 26 milliseconds. So we had to check that all the time. We were doing things like that. So these recalls were just massive.
Wow.
And the guy that did Laughingstock, he was young, he was 18. First big project for him, really, and it destroyed him, man. I mean, a year doing the maths with all these offset machines and getting the right reel, and just the whole process in the dark, inexperienced, it just freaked the guy completely.
Poor guy. It's
Yeah.
it's amazing those two records to have quite there's a different vibe. Like Laughingstock just sounds darker. Like isn't it? Just sounds really darker. Really?
I have real difficulty listening to it. I love After the Flood.
It's an amazing song.
Just incredible.
Amazing.
One of the best things I think I've ever done. But the bass on it that just goes to the center of the earth, the humidity, the claustrophobic, the sound. It's just a whole world. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
But as an album, I can't. I hear it all. I mean, I didn't listen to it for about 10 years anyway, because I didn't want to go back to where I was when I was mixing it.
Yeah.
But then I did finally get through all that and listen to it. But I mean, I hear it once a year at the most. I mean, really? Spirit of Eden, I will listen more often. It's probably more like 4 times a year.
Yeah.
But Laughingstock, no, it's too dark for me. I find it really disturbing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's partly because it brings back stuff of the actual process of recording it. But it is also, I mean, there are a lot of people that say it's the best album, which I do find remarkable.
I think Spirit is probably the best.
Well, Spirit of Eden, I think, is very beautiful in many ways. And there are sections in Laughingstock, like New Grass and things, that are just like uplifting.
Yeah.
Overall, there's something about it, even from the moment it starts, that for me is just dark.
Ominous.
It was dark, when we were making it, because Mark's brother had died. Ideally, we probably shouldn't have been in the studio at that point in time. But the atmosphere in the control room between Tim, Mike, and myself, it was very different to Spirit of Eden. And Paul had left by now. Lee wasn't part of the new Talk deal. He was a kind of hired hand.
Yeah.
There was a lot of just general tension somehow in the air. And, when you turn out all the lights, put on the oil projector, and then don't really talk, that can build up over days or weeks or whatever. So it was a tough album to do. I know that Tim, I think, quoting from my book and that, but he was in an interview and he kind of went, "Well, I know Phil had a bit of a difficult time, but no, I didn't find that." I disagree. I think everyone, the work on that, it had an effect of some sort. I mean, Mark was dark. He was very quiet. Spent a lot of time just kind of staring at the floor and not really talking, which is tricky because he never said much anyway. But if he is the main guy that we're all looking to give us the nod or the erase button, when he's not really seeming to be quiet, as it was all of that. And it's something that just builds up over the months of being in a control room in the dark with oil projectors and erasing so much stuff. I mean, that was the thing. I've always, on Spirit of Eden, we probably erased 75-80% of what we recorded got erased. But on Laughingstock, it's probably 95%.
Wow.
It's just absurd the amount of stuff we recorded and the amount of stuff that just got erased. And we just kept all the time stripping it back, So I know that tracks like After the Flood, which have about 100 tracks of analog, and the track before it, which they're intense, they're big, they're huge. But most of the record, there's not an awful lot going on, and most of it is just stripped back to the bare bones in a way. I mean, just the way the album starts.
Yeah.
AC30 thing, and Lee sounding like he's setting up his kit almost. You know what I mean? There's just these random. It's I mean, I did something recently for Ben Wardle. In fact, I was at his launch for the book originally out in Stroud.
Oh, cool.
So he rented this wonderful kind of shed down by the railway station. And the thing was, he was there being interviewed, then I was there talking, and then they played the whole of Spirit of Eden in the dark with an oil projector. And it was 140 people. And that was quite a trip. I mean, I have to say, these things are so much
give you
part of my
PTSD, did it?
Yeah, as soon as certain things start, it's like, oh yeah, there we go. But I could do it with Spirit of Eden. I actually enjoyed most of the process. I couldn't have done it with Laughing Stock. I don't think I could have stayed in that room for the duration and felt comfortable.
Wow, it's
Although
amazing.
I think it's incredible.
It's amazing. Oh, sorry.
No.
It's amazing that something that can have such an effect on you, and then so many people love. It's an odd dichotomy because people are like, "I love that record." You're like, "I can't listen to it." It's like,
no, it's fantastic, and because those albums were kind of in a way failures at the time, and we had so much grief from record companies. The fact that in the last few years things have been re-released, or there's this big following now, it seems, especially on Facebook, with groups that I kind of know about or belong to. It's almost like Talk, especially Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock, are bigger now than they ever have been, So that's kind of nice, when you see people just saying certain things about records, it's just like, wow, brilliant. Because we just got grief at the time, it was, I mean, the press weren't too bad on Spirit of Eden, but it was the record companies, and Laughing Stock was released and deleted. Well, they sat on it a year before it was released. That was the other thing. So we never knew. Anyway. And then it came out, and then Loose and Grange deleted it 3 months after it was released.
God.
So, again, you kind of, why did people do these things? And he'd spent 400, the album was 400 grand. So you'd think he'd wanted to recoup, but he was so angry. I mean, the record companies just hated us for those albums. It was like, I mean, Laughing Stock, the Polydor got to that point. They were so paranoid. They actually thought the title Laughing Stock was taking the piss out of Polydor for signing the band. Everyone, the depth that those albums created in the chaos department was remarkable. And I'm not surprised in some way that Mark had enough, I mean, it's bad enough for me, but I was just, I'm just the engineer. I mean, I can, once I've done my thing and gone, you might read or know that Ian might think that you've really screwed up, or that, they're going to sue you for technical incompetence or whatever that this week's thing is. But I can walk away from it. But Mark obviously never could.
Yeah.
So I think when you've constantly got these people, saying things or being negative, or just, it must have an effect.
Yeah.
It had an effect on me, and I say I could move away from it. So for him, and when people say, "Oh, I can't stay in the same room as the album," or "Oh, I thought you did that to get out of your deal with EMI," it's all such cutting stuff when you've just done something that you totally, because he really did. I mean, Mark really believed in these records. But whether it's a combination of those 3 albums where he finally walked away, or whether it's just another trait of Mark getting to a certain point and just walking away, well, I've achieved that, or I've had that experience, and then he did with people. So it's really hard to know.
I never get that when people who are like, we say huge rock stars and they have tons of money and they still make the same shitty records all the time. Like, I'd be making like mad experimental music. I'm like,
I know.
Fuck that, man. Do whatever you want.
I'm so with you there. I've often thought that when somebody finally, sells enough to set them up for life, or, they've got 2 or 3 million.
Yeah.
And you think, wow, what freedom. And yet for them, it suddenly seems to be a trap where they're constantly having to recreate Yeah, I did it. Dido is a really great example of that because the first album I got involved with her, it took like 6 weeks, cost about 60 grand, was fun. It's done. You know what I mean? And it goes on to sell 12 million records. So she makes herself 12 million quid. The next album, which admittedly is 3 years later, and all the technology, Rollo had gone into the box digital form of recording rather than our old way of tape machines and S1000s and an Atari computer with MIDI and in the box. And that album took nearly a year. I think it cost close to $1 million.
Oh,
it was really difficult. There was less fun, but it was still like, okay, sold 12 million records, So now Dido is worth about 24 million quid. And she then spends the next 10, 15 years bringing out these albums that are kind of chasing those hits.
Oh, yeah. I remember. Yeah.
And I'd be going, well, I got 24 million quid now. Even if I'm a little reckless, I'm going to be okay here. And what do I want to do? You know what I mean? I just experimented, done anything. It seems such freedom. And yet, for so many people, I've watched artists where it suddenly becomes almost like a trap.
Yeah, they're chasing that. They're chasing that shit, aren't they?
Whether it's them themselves chasing it or whether they're being forced to by the record label or whatever it is, because you suddenly become. I mean, for Dido, really, when I did the first album, it was just Dido. I mean, she had a day job as well, so she'd do it in the evenings. There was like half a dozen of us. And then by the second album, there's a manager and there's assistants and there's all these people. And those artists, if you're that successful, they just become a commodity that everybody is trying to, get their bit of, but also steer. So we want another hit, I think it's sad. I felt sorry for in a way for Dido to have had such a great blistering start, you know what I mean, and doing it for all the right reasons and having fun, and then end up being this like not a casualty, because I think anyone who's that wealthy can't be really a casualty.
No,
emotionally really put through the ringer. And we watched it with what's that guy? Was he in Boyzone?
Ronan Keating.
The other right? Who's the guy that? Oh no, sorry, it's the other band.
Westlife.
Yeah, he left. Robbie Williams.
Take that. Oh, Robbie Williams. Yeah.
He was the same. He got this massive deal from EMI. Went to LA, which is what Dido ended up doing. Moved to LA. And then it all kind of goes wrong for lots of reasons. But everyone seems to do that thing. And like Adele's doing it now, isn't she? She's done the same. Made a lot of money, moved to LA, and just posts all this doom and gloom about her life. So, well,
poor her.
Come back to England and get your act together,
Yeah, once they start living in that bubble, they just spout complete fucking nonsense and they lose sight of reality. Like they're living with all these morons in LA who all think the same. They all have the same opinions.
But they're surrounded, you see, with their little entourage of assistants and the managers. And, I watched it happen, and it's that's what's damaging. They're there to be, in a way, to look after you and make it the best for you. But they become, I think, a big part of the problem. And they're all going to be yes people anyway.
Yeah.
Everyone's going, oh, yes, I mean, McCartney's a perfect example for me. I've got a real problem about that. And he's surrounded by these people. Oh, great idea, Paul. Rather than having a Lennon occasion, you go, fucking hell, Paul, come on, get your act together. That's not good. Try harder. But you end up being, wealthy and surrounded by people that are going, great idea. And that's
man, I would have loved to have seen you engineer some Lennon stuff. That would have been incredible.
I would love to have done that. I was asked long time ago in some interview in the late 70s, and it seems arrogant now, but at the time, and Lennon hadn't been, he was on his weekend, but, he hadn't worked for a couple of years. It was before he came back in 1980. And I said, when I was asked, so, Don Always, who would you really like to work with? And I went, well, Lennon. You know, and I think I said something typical, you know, out of order in a way. But I said instead of him sitting on his ass in, you know, in his apartment in New York, it'd be great to get him in the studio and make a record. You know? But I would love to work with somebody like that, definitely.
Yeah,
I still, yeah, I kind of. There's certain people that you kind of miss, don't you? That had such an impact one way or the other. And I think that, you know, again, the best writing probably is Lennon and McCartney together. You know,
for
they
sure.
were such an amazing team about how they structured and helped each other's things. But Lennon has done some great tracks on his own, whereas McCartney, apart from kind of the Wings band, he's done a lot of embarrassing tracks as well. But you just need somebody to go, no, Paul, that's not right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love McCartney, but at the same time, there's a lot of cheesy shit. You're like, oh, dude, what are you doing? And like you said, Lennon would be like, come on, what the fuck is? You could imagine him just going, what's that shit? You know what I mean? You could just imagine.
McCartney always wants to do that kind of one more love song, or you know, and he's got that slight bent to classical as well. You know, he thinks that because he did some orchestral thing years and years ago he wrote. But no, he needs a Lennon. I mean, they were obviously ideal for each other.
Yeah, yeah. You do need that person who's gonna not be a yes man, which is so. Once you get that big, everyone's you know, they're all afraid to kind of like say anything. You know. I meant to say to you, did you meet Van Dyke Parks when you were working with Little Feat? Because I know he was involved with Lowell George and all that.
Yes, I saw him briefly in a studio in LA. He's a hero of mine. I just
Me
think
too, man. Me too. I love
Discover
songs like that.
that.
Discover America.
Fantastic. And you think of the era that was made in, and the technology, and it's just a mind trip. It's the same as Family, Music in a Doll's House, which was a brilliant album from about '68, done on 8-track. It's just a trip, you know, and how they got some of those sounds and how they managed to do all that with such basic technology. But no, Van Dyke Parks, I just love that album. I mean, it's just so off the wall and great players on it. You know,
amazing.
That's the first.
Amazing.
Because of my weird, you know, I was heavily into Van Dyke Parks, so I heard things like Sailing Shoes, and there's another track from Van Dyke Parks.
Put on your sailing shoes. That's a great song.
Never heard Little Feat version first. I heard.
I'm the same. I'm the exact same. I'm the same as you.
And then when I was with Robert doing Sneaking Sally Through the Alley, we do the Sailing Shoes. Again, I hadn't heard much of Little Feat at that point. This is like 74, 75, 74. And then a massive explosion of, obviously because of working with them, but also just suddenly hearing all those early Little Feat albums. What a band! One of the best bands.
They're like totally underrated. Like totally.
All of them. That's great player. Richie Hayward, I loved. Because even watching him, but it always felt as if at any minute this could all fall apart. You know, that was the excitement of Little Feat. He was just so on the edge. Brilliant players, though. Great and lovely people. I mean, so working with them, that was a real, I mean, that was again hero stuff. But you see, the joke is I don't know if you remember from the book, but Robert was down here. We were doing the overdubs for Sneaking Sully after having got all the backing tracks in America. We had the Island Mobile. We were doing overdubs, and one night we just wrote. We were having fun making up our list of our heroes. So we had drummers, and we had Richie Hayward and Ed Green and James Jamerson for drum bass and Carol Kay. You know, we had these lists of our heroes.
Yeah.
And Steve Smith, who was a kind of house producer for Island, who was producing that, the next morning he sees this scrap of paper with all these things and goes, "What's this?" And Robert and I went, "Oh no, we were just having some fun last night. These are our heroes. These are people we'd love to work with." He said, "Can I borrow this?" He takes the piece of paper, typical American kind of blarney really, but he goes away, spends a couple of weeks on the phone, comes back to us a few weeks later. He goes, "Right, we're in Baltimore for 7 days with Little Feat. We're in New Orleans with the Meatballs."
So cool, man.
Unbelievable. And then we're in LA with an assortment of people. And then in LA, we, Carol Kay, Ed Green, James Jamerson. It was just remarkable. And it also seemed, again, very easy to organize and do. You know what I mean? I know Steve would be making calls and done stuff, but there weren't big meetings with the record label or the budget or the managers. You know, we just ended up in Baltimore. Little Feet had just finished Feet Don't Fail Me Now. So they just agreed, you know, that they'd stay at the studio for an extra 5 days. We'd turn up, we'd cut an album. So that was the deal. So we did. We just kind of turned up, and they played us Feet Don't Fail Me Now, which was kind of probably my introduction to Little Feet. And then we recorded for 5 days, and they fucked off to LA, and we headed off south to New Orleans to do it all again with the meters. But it all just seemed a fantastic adventure, but easy. You know what I mean? There were so many things back in the 70s that just, without all the technology, without the communications that we have now, but we seem to manage to turn up and get these people and end up, you know, working with them.
Yeah. And I hate, like, I know I'm going off on a slight tangent on there, but about communication, like, I hate text. I think text is such an awful medium to, like, you know what I mean? Like, because you can interpretate it wrong. Someone could go, so how are you? And you could be in a pissed off mood going, oh, how are you? All right. So, you know what I mean? It's like such a terrible way to communicate, isn't it? And I think, I don't know, technology has given us, I think with technology, it's given us a lot, but it's taken away more than it's gave us. I think, anyways.
I think it's a danger of doing that. I mean, it is incredible that you can connect, you know, like
we're doing, yeah. Amazing.
You know, my son lives in the Philippines, so, you know, being able to hook up so far around the world, and thinking back to when I grew up in like 50s, 60s, where you had to, you know, phone out and arrange to have a phone call to America. You know, just as a phone call, you couldn't just pick up your phone and dial it. I think where we are now, but I think that the technology always, it always takes away as well. You see, there's this thing with sound, you know, when it was, you know, 4-track on 1/2 inch, 8-track 1 inch, 16-track 2 inch, it was a ratio, and that was the best sound, really. And then we all took a drop in sound quality from 24 on 2 inch from 16. So you got 8 extra tracks, but the sound wasn't as good. But we all accepted that to get the extra 8 tracks. And each time this technology has come along that's in theory improved things, quality hasn't always stayed there. So even with digital, which it came in 79, so I've been around it a long time. But although the hype is digital, it's 2020 and all this kind of excitement about digital, it's a smaller range than analog. It just happens to be quiet.
Yeah.
Which I don't really like anyway. So we kind of, again, lost a slight sound, especially in the 80s when all that early digital came out. So you lose the sound quality, but in order to get some facility. And it's the same now with all these plugins and things. You know, they look like the plugin. They don't really sound much like the real thing, and they take away a bit of your sound by the whole process of putting it in as a plugin. So you lose something, but you gain something, and it's all that now.
Yeah. They've all like those. I use those. You know, I have to use tape. I've never used tape, so when I'm using a tape emulation, like I don't even know what that sounds. Thankfully, I have like outboard gear, and people that say, "Oh, this SSL bus compressor sounds like my outboard," you know, like the emulation. It does not sound like you put something through an outboard SSL bus compressor. It sounds
different.
Yeah.
Plugins, I say, they look the part, and they can get you out of trouble. Some of them are amazing, but it ain't the real thing.
No.
As soon as you come out and go through a real SSL, it's all because it's analog components. Things warm up, things sound different. You get depth. You can't get that in the digital world, it seems. I mean, I thought by now, I say, as it's been around so long, that there'd be certain. I thought that we would eventually end up with Pro Tools sounding like tape. Obviously not. You know, we're still way off that. Yeah. And I think the tech guy years ago, it was at Dave Stewart's place when he had the church in Crouch End, and he was saying that until you can start up and around 400, start scanning stuff at that kind of thing, right? So some people do 192 now, but pushing it past that, and the size of the files and all of that. But he said until you get past 400, he said you're not going to get anywhere close to analog anyway. And that was nearly 30 years ago that he said that.
Crazy.
Still haven't got there. I mean, I say digital has improved. It's workable now.
I think if you low pass a lot of stuff, I find myself I low pass a lot of stuff because it adds that shitty kind of shine to things. That awful.
Yeah, you just want to get rid. I mean, the big problem I've always had with digital is all that excessive kind of floaty top end in a way. So everything, echo, if you bring up a digital reverb, it's always got all this halo gloss. And if you just roll that off to about way down to about 3K or something, it suddenly starts to sound like an EMT echo plate, because they never had all this top end stuff.
Right.
But everyone's used to 15K to 16K, 12, all of this top end stuff, which is not really the analog world. A lot of that old gear. And by rolling off, the top end and just calming everything down. I mean, on the TalkTalk stuff with the SSL, so we weren't really allowed to EQ with the SSL, but our form of top end, if we did have to, EQ anything, and majority of it was sound at source and spent a lot of time with different mics, but we only boosted at like 8K. We didn't do the 10, 12, all the top end gloss. We never got into any of those. It was always like around, we need a bit of that attack, a little bit more light. It'll be a dB or two at 8K. So we kind of, that was another of these kind of weird little things that developed. So although the album's got this huge kind of range, it's not artificially, top end halo at all. It's the opposite, really. It's kind of degraded.
Yeah, because I hate that kind of sound of a lot of those modern records have this that shine. It's like, oh man, it doesn't sound like it's like, oh, it's so bright. It's like, fuck, I hate sounding overly bright records. They sound kind of awful. I'm sure I've done stuff in the past like that I've made cymbals too bright, but it's just because that's what I grew up doing.
Yeah, these things happen. Yeah.
Yeah, but like now I'm kind of very aware of like trying to not do that kind of thing, and it's especially from listening to records like like old jazz records. It's like 4 guys in a room. Yeah, and it's incredible.
Yeah, with ribbon mics, probably, but a few mics, not all this top end stuff, just this reality.
Yeah,
feeling of space and stuff.
The way Rudy Van Gelder used to record those Blue Note records, and he's just in his parents' room, and he's recorded these incredible records with like in a room in his parents' house, and they sound phenomenal. I don't know if you heard those Blue Note reissues that they're pure analog. They started doing them over the last few years, and they're incredible sounding.
Yeah, but I mean, often a living room with a few drapes and curtains stuff could actually sound really good anyway,
Right, right.
Because I mean, the thing about a studio is you're dealing with like a large space, and that's where it all gets trickier with, whether it's too bright, too dead, got weird reverbs or something. But often your living room is actually a very kind of semi-dead, perfect environment. That's why I've done so much stuff kind of down here, really, because it just seemed easier to bring in a mobile and just sit on the floor and do stuff, rather than actually have to be in a studio. So, but yeah, I think a lot of those old records, it was down to, valve mics or ribbon mics, a limited amount of technology, so you couldn't boost lots of stuff. The Helios desk that we had, the top end was 10K, but that was it. And it had a really strange thing in the setup of Helios, so that the more top end you added, it changed the curve. So it would start off at just like 10 dB. But if you put on like 610 dB, it would open up like this and would suck in like 8. So it would give you, the feeling of more top end, but it wasn't pure 10K. those desks were fantastic. I mean, this is like 1970, 69, 70. They were amazing desks.
Wow. It's amazing how like almost we've gone backwards in terms of sound. I notice a lot of younger people now are listening to a lot of older records, and I think they're listening to them because they have this like vibe. Like Queen are bigger than I think they've ever been. Like maybe because of that movie, but I mean those records sound great too.
Yeah, they do. But there's a kind of a rawness and an energy.
Yeah.
On these old records, you know. So there may be mistakes. It may not be hi-fi, but there's that you feel the energy coming through. And I don't think a lot of records today, because we're so used to them being probably hangover from the 80s, but everything can be larger than life. It's all an illusion now.
Yeah.
So you hear these records which don't really mean that much somehow, because they're all perfect. The sounds are all spot on, but it doesn't really feel real to me. A lot of it feels very plastic.
Yeah.
There's no depth. But some of those old records, I mean, they were, I think it's just because it was short of, you know, band, basic mic, a desk with very little gear into a tape machine. It was all very short, kind of from there to there, was not going through a lot of stuff. Whereas now, with all the plugins, with all the processing, it just feels like everything's just more removed.
And quantizing has a weird effect on our brains. It's terrible sounding.
All that vocoder, you know, voice tuning, quantizing. I mean, you don't need all that stuff, you know. Yeah. And it also, I don't see the point, because like we were talking about Littlefeet, but you know, you've got great drummers like Ed Green or with Richie Hayward, and these great James Jameson, these great players. If you start quantizing them and putting them where it should visually be, rather than where they're playing it, you're going to lose all of the feel and all. You know, we're too hung up on perfection and things being visually in time. That's completely irrelevant what it looks like.
Yeah, for sure.
You've got to go, and that was the big advantage with Tortoise, is that we had, you know, although we were doing it almost like today with offsetting, cut and paste, we had no visual clues whatsoever. So we had no screens. We're in the dark. You only had your hearing. You know, when Mark was positioning things, he'd kind of go there, you know, and we'd clock the sympty at that point, and then work out the maths, you know, and then slowly we would fine tune it to where Mark would go, you know, and it would be there, you know. So you were moving things milliseconds sometimes, but it was all done because there was no visual, so it was all done like that's where it should be. You know, you're just going by your hearing.
Yeah, wow.
With sound, with everything.
So
I'll tell you something that you might appreciate, just because how involved those things were. But when we were mixing, Tim and I, because we'd spent so long behind, you know, he had one side of the desk and I had the other, but we'd spent so long sitting behind the 48 channels on listening to a particular song that we'd memorized the pattern of the faders.
That's brilliant.
When we decided to mix after the flood, Tim immediately moved his, you know, faders into his pattern, and I did the same over here. And then we kind of and loaded stuff. I went, okay, play the tape, and then made adjustments. But that absurd track, which was so involved, had so much on it, I think we mixed it in like 3 or 4 hours.
Wow. Because
everything, you know, all our sounds were there. It was all balanced. And because we had this thing in our heads about the shape of stuff, we could 80% of it could come up immediately.
Wow.
Then fine tune it to be in the mix. So that when we mixed that, I remember thinking, God, if we can mix after the flood in 3 or 4 hours, it's going to be easy to mix some of the others. And then of course you get into some of that new grass, which took us like 7 days to mix or something. It was frightening. That, you know, it was a song I couldn't listen to at all. And yeah, it was beautiful, but I mean, I didn't realize that. You know, it was pushing everything to weird limits.
Yeah, wow. Man, those I don't know how many times I have bought Spirit of Eden for people going, just as like on, this is the best. Like for me, I think it's probably one of the best sounding records ever. I know Mark said at some point, you know, it's too produced sounding, and I degrade something. I think it's a drum part. And I'm thinking, even when you degraded the drum part, it still sounded amazing. But when like it was, when I say produced, I mean like, I don't mean like, like those 80s shitty, like
Yeah.
I mean just, it's such a beautifully sounding record. Like everything sonically matches everything, and it's just so, I just think that record just, if you're to ask me what's the best sounding record, I would say Spirit of Eden. I just think it's so incredible. Like
Yeah, I agree with you definitely that it's it's in this. It is incredible. It is in this world.
What records for you do you rate highly? I don't mean just from a production point of view, but like records that you really just, oh man, that you love.
Well, it's going to sound a bit crazy, but there's a band that I've become a bit addicted to over the last few years called Pepe Deluxe.
Okay, I got to check.
They have they have an album out. It's probably about 5 years ago now, called Ocean Wave. Fucking amazing.
Really?
I think so. I mean, track it down,
Pepe
or I
Deluxe.
can if you can't get it, let me know and I'll send you the files.
Oh, thank you very much.
It starts off sounding like it's a 1967 Small Faces or something. This starts up, and then it just takes you on the most amazing sonic and musical trip. It's hard to explain, but that I'm impressed by. But also things like definitely Beach Boys records, I still love.
Did you like Smile? I know, like it's it's
yeah, and it's just remarkable. I think
they're incredible sound. Like Pet Sounds is just like, that album's just like, even we're talking about mistakes. And You Still Believe in Me, there's a little horn that goes like in the back of it, and they couldn't take it out. They just left it in, but it adds to the charm of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, they're just, I think they're kind of remarkable. So that is Music in a Doll's House that I've already mentioned, family, I still go to occasionally. It's just, again, just a trip. And that's like 68 or something. That's old. Pepe Deluxe isn't quite as old. They had another one out recently. I can't remember what it's called now. It's but they had one out that came out probably about 18 months ago.
Okay, I gotta check this out.
Yeah, Pepe Deluxe.
Oh.
And that is how they've got the bottom end on that, because they sent me I'm kind of vaguely involved, in touch with them at least, but they sent me a CD and the vinyl, and the CD has just got this bottom end. I mean, I've got these big old tannoy here with 15-inch speakers. They go down to 20 hertz. They're quite impressive.
Nice
speakers. And I put the CD on, and it's just like, this is insane. It was just like resonating in the house. And then I thought, well, I wonder what they've done on the vinyl, because that's rolled off at 40. So put the vinyl on, but whatever they're using to create this feeling of bottom end, it's there on the vinyl as well. You hear it and go, and they take years to make records. There's two main guys, and I think they're Norwegian or something like that. But brilliant. So I love that stuff.
Cool. Would you ever make a record with them or get involved with them from a record?
Well, I mean, I did a voiceover for one of their things, doing a kind of spoof ad thing for them.
Brilliant.
It was on the record. They had they kind of designed this make-believe kind of guitar pedal that gave you everything you could possibly want. So I was doing one of those kind of voiceovers, which pops up in this thing. But no, it's a bit like Dreadzone, which is another band that I'm a big fan of, and I've been in touch with them. But I just love what they do. You know what I mean? So it's tricky. You kind of go in, and okay, I could, it'd be fun to work with them, and I could change some things. But it's just like, I love what they do. So carry on. You know what I mean? It's one of those. So there's a few bands like that I've approached or been involved with over the last 10 years. Was Dreadzone, another band called Show of Hands, which are folky type band over here. But they're just great records. You know, I put them on, it blows me away. So it's like, well, so how can you get involved in a sense? You know,
Yeah.
you can get involved because you can see that they're at 70% and you could make it 90%.
Yeah.
Brilliant. But when you're hearing something that you kind of go, wow, man, this is 90%, you know, it's hard to then kind of go, well, what would I do to, you know, what would my role be? So
takes the magic away as well. Sometimes if you're involved, you know, you can appreciate it when you're kind of back from it and kind of admire it.
No, definitely. So, I mean, I went and saw up until, I guess, the lockdown a couple of years ago, but I used to go and watch Dreadzone quite a lot. Just a great up reggae-ish type band, really. Great bass lines, clever drums, clever keyboard players, using all kinds of samples and news bulletins and comment, and it's all just like seamlessly kind of put together. It's only a 4-piece band. And then the singer, who unfortunately I think recently it may have kind of left, but he had such a kind of presence as well. He's got some illness with it, you know, he can't stand up for long lengths of time, so he sits on a stool, but he's the most active person I've ever seen sitting on a stool, you know. He has to staff and he just commands, you know. So they're just a great band. They came out of Big Audio Dynamite, which was a kind of 80s band, and they morphed into Dreadzone. But no, as far as old records go, I mean I've been kind of blown away a few times. There's a friend of mine who often sends me kind of compilations of stuff that he finds, and you put on, some of it is kind of old jazz records and things, but you put on stuff and the sound quality is remarkable. And then you look on the thing and it's from 1968. That always throws me, because I go, fuck, you know, whatever I was working on in 68 didn't sound like this. But there's some amazing sounding records from the past, you know, and I'm sure still, even today, there are some great things happening. It's just we're locked into this mainstream pop, vocoder, tune, all of that. That's kind of taken over. The pop world as one, because this thing's always been there. You know, they talked about had all this grief in the 80s because they weren't being poppy enough, or they had no singles. I mean, that's the classic Colour of Spring, when they deliver it to EMI and they go, well, there's no singles, and you've got Live in Another World, Life, you know what I mean? It's just like never changes.
No,
they'll all be the same.
No, they're all like, a lot of those record guys are such bullshitters. Like, I remember when I was like, you know, when you first start like kind of meeting those people, and you'd swear you were the second coming of fucking Jesus with the stuff to say to you, and then a week later you never hear from them again. You're like, what the hell was that, man? Like, you know, like I had a song that was a really poppy song, like it was a Beach Boys-y kind of pre-Fast Brow thing, and they loved it. One record label, I won't say who they are, but they heard the rest of the record. They were kind of like, what the fuck is this? Because it was like classical music and everything on it, you know, like different stuff. But they just want 13 of the same fucking things. And you're like, man, why are you in the record business?
Unfortunately, that's, you know, every time, from my experience, every time you were trying to experiment or do something that was not of the norm, they would hate it. But then as soon as one of those kind of things was a success, then they'd all want more versions of that. You know, so talk like they're screwed up with Spirit, you know, and then, you know, Radiohead and all these other bands that pick up on the back of that and come out with stuff. Then suddenly it all becomes credible, and then they want, you know what I mean? It's never changed, even from the, you know, the guy that turned down the Beatles saying, you know, guitar bands are dead. They've always been around, and the thing is, I think they think they're right. You know, so strongly think they're right, because you know, I'd hate to be an A&R guy in a way, because it's a really tough gig. I mean, to be a good one, it's just wonderful. If you're a really good A&R guy, you can really help that artist. But it all went awry in the 80s again, with the combination, I think, of cocaine and big budgeted albums and those A&R guys, and it all just went mad.
Yeah, because there seems to be more like, even like 70s, 60s, 70s, and then kind of up until the 80s, up to a point, there was bands that were like, you could say experimenting, like the Pink Floyd and stuff like that, that were like commercial bands, like huge bands. And then that kind of, once the whole money kind of came into it, was like, okay, we need to rein this in.
It was after the punk. I've got this theory that it was after punk, really, because punk kind of blew open the music, the comfortable music scene, if you like.
Right.
And a lot of the record companies got ripped off by signing bands that never produced anything, or took the money and then went like the Sex Pistols, then signed somebody else. And I think that by 1979, 1980, which is when all the lawyers started to get involved in companies and the A&R guys really took off. And I think it was a way of trying to get back control of what was happening. Because I was in the business from, 67 till, at least 77, 78. I never met an A&R guy really. On session. Yeah. They because their role, once you're in the studio, their role was over in a way. They needed to be there kind of helping the artist originally it was repertoire, artist and repertoire, is what it's doing. So helping them with songs or finding songs. And then at the end, when the album's delivered, to get all the, promotional thing, get it all under control and launch it. But they didn't have much to do with the process of making a record then. So I never met them. I met managers, lots of producers, arrangers, all kinds of people that making, but never A&R guys. And then they slowly appeared at the end of the 70s and then all through the 80s.
Right.
And they would, like Dido, same as going back to that, did the first album, no A&R guy, obviously, because she had no deal, no manager, no one. Second album, admittedly 3 years later, she had 3 A&R guys. Imagine putting her through that. So 2 of them were based in London, and they would turn up together, like Laurel and Hardy, and come out with all their usual stuff. And the other guy was in LA, and he would turn up kind of every month, and he was always into what was happening on the streets of LA at the moment.
Okay.
And it's a complete red herring, because a lot of that scene that was going on at the end of the 90s in LA, these beats or whatever it was, these things were like for 2 weeks, and then something else would be, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
Really transient. And so he would turn up with something that was happening on the streets kind of that week. But by the time he played it to us and we'd put it into a record, and then 3 or 4, 6, 8 months later, it didn't mean anything. So we had a lot of interference, but I never met them originally. But you get a good A&R guy, they can really help you and can be really constructive. But there were so many that I met, especially in the 80s, they were just, saying all kinds of stuff, taking home huge amounts of money. Their pay packets were vast, and their cocaine habits were vast. They just, they weren't constructive. They could actually undermine sessions as much as help you. I had so many of those things where the guy would turn up, and an hour or 2 later, everything was just starting to disintegrate, either because he'd wound up the band, or if you were in a mixed situation, you got it like 95% there. He turns out, oh, what about this? What about that? Change the snare drum. What about this? And when you've done those things, mixes can be quite fragile at times.
Yeah.
Messed around for an hour or 2, and you've suddenly kind of lost what you had anyway. So I hated it.
Yeah, I remember there was the story about Song Cycle, that Van Dyke Parks record was like a complete, like an utter failure. And they advertised in a magazine saying we've lost 45,000 or whatever on this most expensive record. But they pushed it. They tried to push an album like that. Whereas and I think Zappa said that, it was like, you were better off when you had the guys that didn't kind of know anything about records, because they were we'll just take a chance on that. Whereas people then became a bit too kind of,
Well, they
almost
thought they could pick a winner of it, so again, all through the 80s, that thing of designer bands. It's always been around, but the whole image thing and thinking that if you get the right song, well, I mean, they were probably right in some cases with all the payola and stuff. But the whole kind of, it became a factory, a manufactured thing.
Yeah.
And there's always been that in the music, but there's always had that kind of manufactured band. But it was quite well balanced, I think, up until more recent years, where other things could come through. I mean, you look at Ireland, they had such an eclectic kind of roster, but I mean, they had things like Quintessence, where their album was a gatefold thing that opened up and was like an altar, and they did kind of Indian head music. This was on Ireland, along with Roxy Music and cats do Nick Drake. These kind of so they did take. I mean, Blackwell in his book that I just read, but he was a massive gambler.
Oh right.
Yeah, I mean, he was a gambler anyway. On like regular things like horses.
Oh, I thought you meant gambler, like horse and gambler.
And he mentions it a lot himself in the book about him gambling, but he gambled on people. I mean, he would take a chance on somebody just on a handshake. Bob Marley, Catch a Fire. He gave him like $20,000 or whatever it was because he turned up and said, I want some money to make a record, and Blackwell just gave him that.
Wow.
Without any contracts. And the people in the office were saying things like, "You're mad, you'll never see him again." He goes, "I have faith, And like 3 months later, he comes back with the beginning of Catch a Fire, which was the start of their huge relationship. But Blackwell was a gambler. I mean, I was around him when he used to gamble on stopwatches. We had one built into the desk.
Brilliant.
And he'd cover it and just start it and stop it. And you had to basically guess what the number was.
Wow.
And that was, just one of the many things that we passed our time with. You just close it over and you go like 0-4, and if it was right, you got a $5. I mean,
oh wow,
big odds. But most of the time you're not going to get it because it's not as easy as you think. And everyone's like paying it. Okay. He gambled on pretty much everything: people, artists, business deals.
Wow.
And he admits it. That's the thing. It's great because he actually talked quite openly about, that was another gamble. Didn't pay off.
I love
Most of the time they did, you see.
What do you miss most about all those sessions? I'm sure there's many things, but is there like?
Well, I think I do miss being in a control with kind of 5 musicians. I suppose that's my default. I just loved that thing. The vibe of it all, the way you kind of everyone's constructive and all heading off into it. Most of the time, obviously you do sessions where you work with some people that are a nightmare, but I mean, majority of the time, I'd say 80% of my life were just like sessions that were fun to do. Yeah. And so I do miss that. I miss like hanging out in the control room with wonderful old gear, all getting hot. And a bunch of musicians. I think that's what I miss the most. I certainly don't miss the business side of it or the record company side of it, because that's what I've always kind of hated that right from when I started.
Yeah,
I had a problem with it right from day one.
All that politics, I'm sure, gets fucking annoying.
Yeah. And it was like at Ireland, when I was working for Island Studios, and for me, it was I was working for Island Studios. That's who given me the job. The fact that Chris owned it as well didn't matter. So I saw myself very much as like a studio engineer. I had nothing to do with Island Records. And in fact...
is that how you met your wife at Island, yeah?
Yeah, she used to she was running the studio. So she technically was my boss at one point. But I made a decision when I got offered this job there. I don't know why, but it was really a good move. But I was pretty young, so I'm not quite sure why. It might have been my hatred for record labels. But I decided to do all the outside acts at Island. So I wouldn't work for any Island artists at Island Studios. So because I took that really strange decision, it seems now, but that's how I got to work with like Jeff Beck and Zeppelin and things, because they weren't anything to do with Ireland. They were outside clients. So I was doing all the outside clients. So I got to work with some amazing things. And it wasn't until, I'd been there probably 3 years, around 73, when I started doing some things like Jimmy Cliff and then together with Blackwell doing the Wailers, and then Robert Palmer, and then John. You know, I ended up doing a lot of island stuff. But for the first 3 years, I just did all the outside clients. So I got to work with, you know, that's like Susie Quattro, you know,
Cool.
Harry Nilsson, you know, all kinds of people that
Oh, you did Nelson Schmelson, did you?
Yeah, Nilsson Schmelson.
Brilliant record, man. Wow.
Yeah.
There's all that connection with like Van Dyke and Little Feat and all. They're all that kind of group, kind of, aren't they?
And I mean, that really, that album does hold up really well for being 50 years old or something. I mean, there's some great playing on that.
It's a
some
great
songs. It's a really cool record, yeah.
And the vibe of those sessions, like Hendrix and Zepp, that must have been just fuck, man. Like shit, like because like, you know, they're so they're not tangible like to anyone, you know. They're just there must have been just like when you look back on it, you must be like, wow, man. Well, at the time, were you like really conscious of it, or were you like
all along the Watchtower? I was conscious of just what that sounded like. Still stay with me all these years.
wow.
But what that sounded like in Studio One at Olympic through the Tannoy Lockwoods off a 4-track machine, you know what I mean? It was phenomenally exciting.
Wow.
That was probably one of the first things tape hopping on where something came out of the speaker. It was just like, wow, this is fucking amazing.
Savage.
And that stayed with me. I mean, it still sounds like that to me. I was doing kind of an evening with a few weeks back, and I played that, and yeah, it still sounds remarkable, I think.
Man, that's so class. It just does. I can't even imagine what those things must have been like. It must have been amazing. That I know when you said to Mark about when he asked you when you got out of the car about your opinion about Olympia, and you were saying traffic. What was that traffic session, or what was that exact moment that you were actually talking about?
Because when I started at Olympic and I was working with this guy Keith Grant, who was the boss, basically on a month's trial, you know. So, and I did all his sessions. So I was, you know, with him doing 50-piece orchestras with Dusty Springfield and Leonard Cohen and Harry Seacombe and, you know, various Anita Harris, and then Traffic, Mr. Fantasy was the track we were doing.
Cool,
that was
man.
my first rock session that I was put on. So I passed the test, I guess.
Right.
You know, deemed safe, and I was put on this night session with Traffic, and it was like stepping from just totally different worlds. You know, the orchestral stuff in the daytime, you know, you got bright lights, everything's being read, it's union controlled, you know, it's strict stuff.
Right, yeah.
And suddenly you go into a Traffic session, all the lights are out, there's candles, there's incense, there's friends just hanging out in the studio. So it had a big effect on me. So I definitely, when Mark said, you know, so what sums it up, to be able to kind of go, oh, you know, 1 a.m. November 67 was easy because that was Traffic. And
wow.
it stayed with me, you know. And again, the things that they were doing, like, I mean, I've always wanted to try this again, but taking headphones, and they got the track coming through the headphone, and Jim Capaldi is doing this thing with his mouth, you know how you kind of change, and he's making shapes with his mouth while the headphones are playing across his mouth, and you get this a fantastic effect, and it's on the record, it's on Heaven Is In Your Mind. But it was just things like that, you know, going from, say, that really straight clinical recordings of straight musicians, if you like, to suddenly hanging out with people who are experimenting, and only a year or two older than, I mean, Winwood was like 18 and I was like just 17, you know what I mean? We were just kids. And Winwood had already had Spencer Davis band for 3 or 4 years, you know, when he was like 15. So it was just that it suddenly became like your generation, and people behaving in a way that made so much more sense to me than the straighter sessions. But, yeah.
That just, it must be
I was said to you right at the beginning, I mean, it's just that thing of being lucky, you know, I mean, work my ass off, but just lucky to be at to get at Olympic at that point in time. I worked with Hendrix purely by default. I was stripping down a string session in the evening. They were at a party in London, and Eddie phoned up and just said, "Who's in one?" I went, "I am. I'm just stripping down the strings. He went, "Anyone in?" "No, we're coming down." And then he turned up, and Noel Redding didn't bother turning up because they'd been at a party. He wrote in his book that we'd all been drinking. I thought it was a waste of time. So Hendrix played bass. Dave Mason from Traffic, he turned up, played acoustic. Brian Jones turned up with his girlfriend. They'd just come from this party, And then 3 hours later, you set out for bass, drums, guitar, and cut in a track. So it was, everything seemed, as I said to you before, really quite spontaneous and kind of easy to set up and do. It's over the years, it just seems to have become harder and harder to have access to people.
Yeah.
Going through managers and record companies and doing it all the straight way. Back then, it just seemed like Winwood. He used to hang out at Island when Island Studio. So there was this guy, Lucky Gordon, who's a Rasta, who used to cook soul food. So at night, he'd be cooking soul food down in the kitchen. And musicians and local Rastas and dealers and stuff, everyone would just turn up and hang out. So, I was working up in Studio One. There's so many nights where 3 a.m. So, you wander down and get a cup of tea. And there's like Steve Winwood and Chris Wood just hanging out with Lucky, eating some soul food. And really, it must have been at least 3 or 4 times when I come down and Winwood's there, and I'll go, "Oh, look, have you got 15 minutes? Do you want to come up and have a spliff and play a bit of Hammond?"
Oh man,
Steve playing on the record, or Chris Wood. I mean, it just seemed, I was spoiled. It just seemed so easy, And then as time went on, and I say definitely by the time we hit the 80s, it all became much more of an industry, and you had to track people down and speak to managers, and all that vibe of hanging out had gone, you see.
Yeah.
The new studio manager that took over at Basing Street, I think about 2 weeks after he took over, got everyone together, all the engineers, maintenance guys. We had 4 engineers, 4 maintenance, 4 assistants. So we could run 2 studios 24 hours. So we got everyone together. I remember him saying, "This can't possibly work. We've been doing it for like 3 years. It's like a 24-hour party, but people were working at the same time,
Yeah.
And he freaked him out. He went, "This just cannot work." And he went, "But it's fine, we're doing a vast amount of work." He goes, "That's not the point. This is just madness." So he started to straighten things up, and then Lucky, I think, was asked not to come and cook the salt. They're all just
shit, man.
The change. But for about 3 years, it was like almost like a 24-hour party. The place just ran 24 hours a day.
Wow.
You could only book midday till midnight or midnight to midday. You couldn't do a lockout at that point.
I love it. The vibe must have been just incredible.
Yeah.
Wow, man. So cool. I must tell you something before you leave. When I read Ben's book, there was a thing when he used to say that Mark used to visit the west of Ireland, and I'm from the west of Ireland. And then he said, he played Electric Picnic, or not played Electric, he visited Electric Picnic in 2011, and I was thinking, I played there that year, and I remember walking around, seeing it, just walk around, I seen a guy, I was like, "Oh, that looks like Mark Hollis." I thought, what the fuck would Mark Hollis be doing in Electric Picnic? Like, come on, man, the guy doesn't go either. I was thinking, holy shit, that was Mark Hollis. That's so crazy, like, I just thought, man, that was Mark Hollis. But in my brain, I was thinking, why would Mark Hollis be anywhere with a load of people at a festival? But turns out he was there, which I thought, well.
No, I mean, we went to the Irish festival in Finsbury Park. He and I went there. 2000, 2001. Wow. It was when he'd stopped kind of, okay, I'm going to stop being an artist, as it were. But he and I were going to co-produce other people. So we ended up doing 2 tracks with Anya Garbrick. That's all we managed to do. And then that was it.
Yeah.
We went to this festival to see Massive Attack That was
Wow.
chaos, which would have been brilliant,
Wow.
and somebody else. And yeah, I mean, Mark dealt again, I suppose, with the way, you know, he likes to be able to control his environment. And if you're at a festival, it's the last place that you can control anything.
Yeah.
So it was kind of interesting because with Massive Attack, with the band we'd gone to see, because that's who we might be working with, there was a lot of interference from other tents and noises, you know, and rather than just kind of really just home in and concentrate on this, you know, Mark was just getting more and more, you know, bugged out, weirded out by this. And no, this is no.
I'm with him on that. I'm not a huge fan of. There's too many people that can be like, oh man.
Yeah.
how'd
Oh
you
yeah.
get-"
I'm not really good in crowds anymore. And I think the last 2 years has probably accentuated that, just because I did you know, I didn't go out and do much for 2 years, so I just hid away, which is
Yeah.
fun. But then it's just like, it's noise as well, isn't it? It's like the world is so fucking noisy.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll
And
probably let you go.
And people are lunatics too. So
Yeah, there's always that.
But oh man, like, thank you so much for doing this. Shit, man. I'm sorry if I took too much of your time.
No,
I could talk for hours. It's so much. I always like when I speak to people that I admire. Always afterwards, I go, oh shit, I should ask them that. I should ask them that. And I'm sure I'm gonna go, oh man, I should ask you that. But hey, thank you so much, Phill, man. I'd love to do it again sometime if you.
No, anytime really. If anything, if you know,
Brilliant.
if anything comes up or you remember something,
Brilliant, man. That's cool, man. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. And yeah, man, you made some fucking incredible records. So good, man.
You.
Cheers, brother. Have a nice night.
Cheers,
man.
Thank you, mate.
Thanks, Phill. Bye bye.